Morning, everybody. Good to see you here. Thanks so much for coming. My name is Matthew. I'm the lead pastor here, so I want to welcome you all. I'll talk about the series we're in at the moment in a second. Just want to mention a couple of things. First one is, you may have got a copy of this on email this week if you've signed up on our website, but we have a quarterly newsletter. It's a brand new publication that we're bringing out. The idea is really just to share stories from our community, share some things that are coming up, some important things that are coming up over the course of the next few months, but also looking back over what we've been doing, how we've been working towards our vision, some of the exciting things that are happening in our community. I feel in a very privileged position in my role that I get to hear so many of the stories, talk with so many people, and that's not necessarily true for all of us. So this is, I think, going to be a real help in us knowing a bit more about our community, and feeling like we're part of that more. And maybe, you'll get to contribute to some of these stories over the next few months and years, right? We're going to bring it out every quarter. There's also some financial updates in there, which we'll put in just to keep us all aware of those kinds of things as well. So do check that out. I think we've got copies of this available outside, Sarah. Yeah, so there's hard copies. And then you may have received this by email also this previous week. Which, by the way, if you go to our website and sign up on our website, it'll mean you automatically get all our various updates. We'll send them out, I guess, small ones every couple of weeks or so, and you'll get this one as well every quarter. So just wanted to mention that. Also wanted to mention that after the service today, a few people are going to be holding a tree planting ceremony as a memorial to Betsy Mitchell-Henning. Betsy worked here, was very dear to us, and tragically died about a year and a half ago now. And so out in the front parking lot on this side, right after the service, we're going to be planting a tree, and everybody is very welcome to come to that. It's going to be a very, very simple, short, brief service. But just wanted everyone to feel very welcome to come along to that right after the service today. Okay, so we're in a series called Reconciliation in a Time of Fear, and we're looking at a bunch of different issues that are sort of cultural issues, cultural challenges, and also personal challenges. It's been, I think, a very engaging, very challenging series for us. We're looking at issues of social justice. How can we, as followers of Jesus, contribute to, through our own lives and our influence on others, a more just society, a more fair society, a more right society. And it's brought up lots of great issues, lots of controversial issues too. Actually, on the controversial front, I was going to just share with you, I found this down by the beehives the other day. And I don't know whether anybody owns it, actually. My immediate thought was, because we've been talking about controversial issues, maybe this was a drone that has been sort of checking up on us and crash landed. But seriously, I did find this down by the beehives. If anybody was flying an what do you call these, remote control airplanes, come and claim it afterwards. But it just sort of crash landed, so I don't know, maybe it was somebody else on our property. But we've been talking about these challenging issues. We have not been picking issues out of a hat or out of thin air, right? We've been the reason we've looked at the four main issues we have in this series: issues of race, issues to do with money, economics, issues to do with religion, and the division between religions. And today we're going to be talking about peace as opposed to violence. The reason we're looking at all these issues is because earlier in the year we looked at the book of Amos, a prophetic book in the Hebrew Scriptures. And as we looked at that scripture, we saw that Amos is a very key prophet in the Hebrew tradition. Right? He was one of the earliest, probably the earliest, writing prophets. So we have these prophets who wrote down their prophecies, or other people wrote it down for them. People like Isaiah, Jeremiah, etc. Amos was one of the first of those, and he kind of sets the stage and sets the tone for all the prophetic writings that come after that, and he makes a big deal of what is going on in society and the fairness of society or not. And we, from that series, we kind of drew out four themes, which are the themes of unfairness based on ethnicity and race, unfairness based on economics, unfairness based on religion, the way certain religions can treat other religions poorly. I mean, all religions are guilty of that, and the division and hatred that can be caused by religion, rather than what religion is meant to be, which is healing and life-giving. And then issues to do with violence and as opposed to peace. And in fact, maybe we can just look at that first Amos scripture actually. In Amos chapter 1, it says this is what the Lord says: "For 3 sins of Edom, even for 4, I will not relent." Okay, so you may remember, if you were here for that series, that Amos kind of points the finger at numerous nations. And in this instance, the nation of Edom, it's because he pursued his brother with a sword and slaughtered the women of the land, because his anger raged continually and his fury flamed unchecked. Okay, so that's classic Amos, very hyperbolic language, very colourful language. But it's to do with violence, it's to do with the waging of war and injustice based on that. So that's why we're taking this issue today of peace. We're looking at, the theme today is waging peace. Okay, it's really saying, as people who followed Jesus, who came in that prophetic tradition. Okay, Jesus talked a lot about the prophets. He talked a lot about what they had to say. He used very similar language to the prophets. Jesus was somebody who stood for peace as opposed to violence. We're going to look at some of the ways that Jesus talked about that and acted like that. And I think it's important to see where this is grounded. Okay, it's grounded in the Hebrew tradition of the prophets and in Jesus himself. So we're going to kind of wrestle with those issues today. Now, while we're talking about the prophets, let's just look at another quote from perhaps the most famous of the Hebrew prophets, Isaiah. In chapter 2, right at the beginning of his very large book, it says this: "In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains." So Isaiah is looking forward to some kind of future state, future existence. It will be exalted above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways so that we may walk in his paths." Okay, that's kind of what we're trying to do here, right? We're trying to walk in the way of God. We're trying to work out what that means, what that looks like. We're trying to be faithful to that. "The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Come, descendants of Jacob, let us walk in the light of the Lord." So what we're seeing here is this prophetic future thinking sense of what the world could be like. You know, we use the term, the Hebrew term shalom for this, you know, and that's a word that gets perhaps, you know, overused in some respects, but that's this sense of a peaceful existence, a peaceful way of life, things being right, the world being in a whole healthy state. And these prophets talked about that as a possibility. Jesus comes in that tradition talking about that as not only a possibility, but that's something that we should pursue. He called it the kingdom of God. And he said, you know, seek the kingdom of God because it's at hand, it's close by, it's not unrealistic, it's possible. So when we think about the Hebrew concept of shalom, and we think about the Jesus concept of the kingdom, we're reaching out for something that we're told is real and doable, even though it's incredibly challenging, right? So that kind of state of peace, of nations laying down weapons and swords being beaten into plowshares, I mean, that perhaps in some respects feels unrealistic, especially when we look around the world today. And yet that's what we've been called to. So we're taking on this huge challenge. So what we're doing in this series, and in particular today, I mean, not that today's any different from any of the other weeks, but we're just kind of courageously saying, let's look at these issues. Let's see what Jesus says to us about this, and then let's courageously pursue Jesus. Let's courageously follow Jesus into wherever that might take us, as we think about what does it mean to be wages of peace. All right, and there's a sort of a proactive sense to that, right? It's not peace may not just be the absence of conflict, or even the denial of conflict, and we might consider ourselves to have peaceful lives relatively, but rather it's a pursuit of something. It's a pursuit of change that's going to create a fairer, more peaceful, more peace-loving world. And you know, we have various degrees of influence over the world, right? I mean, we certainly have influence over ourselves, but we have some kind of broader influence too. So we're going to explore that. Now, what I want to do, the approach I want to take, because I think we all know that the world is in a pretty sorry state, right? I mean, we'll look at one or two statistics later on, but there's a lot of conflict in the world. There's a lot of very violent conflict in the world. And I've got half an hour or so. I want to assure you, just honesty in advertising and all the rest of it, that I'm not going to solve the problem in this next 30 minutes. And I'm probably not going to say anything that you haven't heard before, because I get up here a lot and I kind of, I run out of material after a while. You know how it is. So most of what we've heard here today, we've probably heard before. But I guess I want us to take a fresh look at this issue and maybe think about it in a personal kind of way, right? So what we're talking about has consequences for the planet, right? It's a very big, heavy, macro issue. But one of our traditions here at Cedar Ridge, one of our values here, is not to point the finger, right? We don't say, you need a change, you've got a problem, etc., etc. We say, okay, how can I change? How can I be part of the answer? So we're going to take a sort of somewhat personal, reflective look at this. And we have in our material, so we have a workbook that accompanies this series. It's coming, we're coming to the last chapter of that series now. But in the workbook there is, and we'll be studying those discussion questions in the material this week in our groups. And if you're not in a group, as an individual, you can just read through those and sort of think them through, maybe chat them through with a friend. But we get at, in those questions, some opportunities, there's some opportunities for us to reflect on action we can take. And throughout this series, we've been asking for feedback in general, which we'll process some more in the forum next week. I'll talk more about that before the end. But we're looking for feedback. We're looking for practical action and that kind of thing. So a lot of that is in the material. So check that out, read that, wrestle with it, express your own opinions. Let's deal with that. Right now, I guess I'm asking us just to be a little more reflective and sort of look at our own hearts. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at 4 things, 4 challenges, 4 problems that I think can cloud our reflections, right? Can kind of muddy the waters a little bit. So we'll look at those, and then we're going to look at 4 passages or 4 quotes from Jesus, all from the same chapter of Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5, which is part of a section known as the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus talks a lot about peace at a very personal, individual level. Okay, so we're going to start off with these kind of 4 challenges, 4 things that kind of maybe impede our thinking, our processing, and complicate things a little bit. So the first one is this, that I think, and you can sort of consider where you're at on this, but I think we have a love-hate relationship with violence. Right? We struggle with violence. On the one hand, we're appalled by violence, right? We read or we see images of things happening in real life around the world, and we're appalled by it, and it's shocking to us. And yet, in another way, we kind of harbor violence and sort of enjoy violence, especially when it's people we think are getting what they deserve, right? So let me talk a little bit about from my own experience with that. So I find violence really disturbing. Like I went to see the movie Saving Private Ryan once. Has anybody seen that movie? All right. I mean, a really amazing movie, great movie. It's the kind of movie I would say everybody should watch, but just watch it once. It's not a go back, feel good kind of movie, right? The context of me seeing that movie, it was my wife's birthday, and but let me just stress, I didn't make the decision to go and see Saving Private Ryan. Okay, this is whenever it came out, I guess. It's probably about 15 years old now, isn't it? Or more than that. It must be more than that, about 17 years old. So it was some time ago now. And she said, we were talking about what we're going to do for the birthday. Let's go out and see a movie. And we had really young kids then, didn't get to do that too much. So we went out, and she picked the movie, Saving Private Ryan. It was one of those ones where it just got past me. I hadn't even read about it, didn't know anything about it. I just knew it was a war movie. And I was really surprised that my wife wanted to go see a war movie. She doesn't normally make those choices. But I thought, great. So I sort of showed up. We were a little bit late, missed the trailers, but we got in just as the movie started, and I had my popcorn. I took a mouthful of popcorn, and then I just was frozen in that position for about the next 2.5 hours because this traumatic World War II scenario exploded, the Normandy invasions, and then all the rest of the movie, and I won't talk too much about the movie, But it was violent and graphic, but I'd seen graphic violence before, right? We're actually quite used to that. I don't watch movies for the violence, but many great movies had violent themes to them, right? So it wasn't like, oh, I've never seen this before. There was something really intimate about it, something very personal about it. I felt I related to these people who were being decimated on the beaches, and the horror of war just became so real, and so, to the point where I couldn't eat my popcorn. And I sat through the movie motionless, and then silently walked out with my wife, and we got to the car, and I just cried my eyes out. I just uncontrollably crying. It was a great birthday for my wife, because she sat there. We'd been married about 10 years. She sort of knew me pretty well, but she hadn't really seen me like this before. And I'm sort of head on the steering wheel, sobbing into the floor of the car. And I was just so traumatized by it, because it's so horrific. It's so, the thought that we do that to one another, that we have done that to one another not that long ago, and that we're still doing it to one another. It's just awful. It's horrendous. And yet, on the other side of it, a relatively more recent story, a few years ago, and it must be, I guess, 6 or 7 years ago now, because it was when my girls, I have 2 girls, 2 boys. I have one boy leaving high school at the moment, another in high school, and 2 girls are at college. So this was when the girls were in high school, so I know, 5, 6 years ago. And we started getting our house egged, and people putting toilet paper on the tree out the front, right? This is in our old house, which apparently was because some of the local high school boys like my daughters. And I'm like, what's wrong with champagne and flowers? I mean, where do eggs come into it and toilet paper on a tree? I don't really, that's the deal apparently. So that was a cultural education for me, one. But I got, first time you pull in the toilet paper off, it's like, yeah, that's funny. Second time, it's not funny. Third time, I want to kill them, right? And then when the eggs start coming, and it's summer, and there's I lost count of the number of eggs on the roof that faces south, so it's getting all the sun, and just things. So the next time I heard them, the eggs hit the window, early hours in the mornings, it's like 2, 3 a.m. I got out of bed. I was dressed only in my boxer shorts, no shoes, and I chased them down the road. And I didn't catch them. I think if I had shoes on, I'd have caught them, to be honest. But my girl, this may make me sound a little crazy. I really wanted to catch them. So I slept on the couch, because I would have quicker access to the front door for a couple of nights, and they never came back. I think probably they'd seen this guy chasing them in boxer shorts the night before and thought, we're never going to do that again. But my girls asked me, they said, Dad, what would you have done if you had caught them? So there's me, as a 40-year-old or whatever back then, in my boxer shorts, I've caught a couple of teenagers, or 3 or 4 of them, at 2 or 3 in the morning. That wouldn't have looked very good, but also it made me realize that, I probably wasn't actually going to commit any acts of violence, but I might make them afraid that acts of violence might get committed, right? And I thought, have you ever done that before? I think I've talked about this before, where you can find yourself going through a scenario in your own mind where you hope so-and-so gets this, or you're so mad that, man, I'd hit that person, do the rest of it. I may be just the only psycho in the room, but I think it's more common than we all like to let on. So in other words, we all harbor this anger. We all harbor a sense of justice that can lead to retaliation. We all, I think, potentially harbor violence, unspeakable acts of violence in our own hearts. It's part of the human condition. In fact, I think it's really interesting. Go back to the beginning of Genesis. Look at the first few verses in the section of Genesis that kind of deals with the human condition. For me personally, I'm not so sure we should take some of these stories literally, but they get at a deep truth about humanity. Let's look at a couple of verses. In chapter 3, it says, God says, where are you? Okay, so the Lord called to the man, where are you? There's this division between God and man, okay, because the men and women eat the apple, and it all goes wrong, and there's separation between God and man. So God is like asks the question, where are you? In the next chapter, in chapter 4, it's a different kind of question. In that story, Adam and Eve have children, Cain and Abel. and they get into an argument, and there's jealousy. You have to read the story, but there's all sorts of jealousy, and it results in murder. And it says, now Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out to the field. While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? So there's this question, where are you? There's this division between God and humanity. And God says, where are you? There's this division. But then there's this another division. Where is your brother Abel? There's this division between humans and humans, right? And he says, I don't know, he replied. Am I my brother's keeper? And there's this sort of excuse of, I'm not really responsible for my fellow person. And we see here, again, I think in a very profound story, the human condition of division, how easily we get jealous, hateful, and we seek retribution, and that leads to all kinds of horrible outcomes. So there's this, we have, as human beings, we have this capacity for violence, we have this capacity for hatred, and even though we're kind of shocked when we read stories about, let's say, the conflict in Serbia and Croatia, where Serbs and Croats are living next door to each other and then suddenly turn violent with one another, or stories of Tutsis or Hutus in Rwanda and where they turn against one another, or stories from Syria, where it seems like, I think in the last, in the recent conflict in Syria, over nearly now 250,000 people have died. And that's just astounding. We kind of think, that would never happen to us. We would never participate in that kind of violence and that kind of atrocities. Well, I think to some degree we're kidding ourselves. I mean, we just have a different context, right? We have different things that prevent that happening in our culture, and we have a certain level of peace in our culture that means we're not being stirred up that same way. But violence is part of all of us, and so I am at least asking us to think about that as we think about waging peace, as we think about being followers of Jesus in the way of peace. We have to think through, to what degree does our own connection to violence, on the one hand we're appalled by it, on the other hand it feeds something in us. We want revenge. If somebody acts violently on the other side of the world to people that we feel in any way connected to, or maybe not, or just connected to as human beings, there's a knee-jerk reaction of wanting to fight back, I think. To what degree are those problematic human reactions that contribute and influence us, influence the way we live our lives, and to what degree are they reactions that we're called to as followers of Jesus, right? So let's reflect on that. Let's think about that. To what degree does that have a hold on us personally? Here's another issue that I think is kind of problematic for us as we think about this issue of violence. I've touched on it already. It's just so overwhelming, right? So we have this love-hate relationship with it, and then the second issue is just so overwhelming. There's so much violence in the world, and we could think through. Well, even if we think about our own lives and examine our own hearts, to what degree can we really influence what's going on in all these other countries or what's going on around us, right? So we've got to sort of separate ourselves from it being overwhelming and say, okay, God, I'm still going to just look at these issues. I'm still going to consider what's going on here. I think even as I was thinking about preparing this message, we struggle here, I think, as followers of Jesus, especially during these discipleship series, we take on huge issues, right? We've been talking about race, we've been talking about injustice in economics, we've been talking about the injustice within religious systems, and we talked last week, Eric talked about the Israel-Palestine conflict. I mean, these are huge issues, and they can be overwhelming. So I think we just have to kind of calm down from it and say, okay, God, we can't do everything, we can't take everything on, but we can allow these things to cause us to reflect on our own lives and the degree to which we can make changes ourselves. Okay, so what I'm saying there is, let's not just brush it aside because it's just too much. Let's just let this interact with us of ourselves with God take place. Third issue that I think is problematic, and I'm just going to kind of deal with this one briefly, but I think it's a big issue, is there's a lot of violence in the Bible, right? And I can't even deal with it. I can't even deal with these issues of violence because they're all present in the Bible. For instance, I mean, did anybody grow up going to Sunday school here, going to church as a child, right? Quite a lot of people. Not everybody, it's great. I went to Sunday school as a child. Remember the story of the Battle of Jericho, right? Battle of Jericho, Joshua gets people to march around Jericho. And I can remember acting that out as a child, actually. We sort of, in different settings, you'd march around and the walls fall down. What we didn't act out was what happens after that, which is that the Israelites then go into the city and kill every man, woman, and child, and animals, the whole lot, decimated, right? So there are some people who would say, well, that's what religion's about. Religion breeds violence. I think that can cause us to feel uncomfortable with Scripture, uncomfortable with the Bible, and then we kind of just push it all away rather than engage with it. So, and that would be a whole series on its own, right? Dealing with how do we explain violence in the Bible? Because if I started saying, hey, let's go over to that place or that place and take out every man, woman, and child and animal, you would lock me up, rightly so. Right? We just would not tolerate that now in any sense. And I don't think Jesus tolerates that. Jesus is not talking about that. So Jesus, and that's the way we're going to take it, is that Jesus comes, and we're going to see in a couple of scriptures in a moment, reinterpreting people's view of God. People might view God as, well, God brings retribution on these people and retribution on those people, and these are the good people and those are the bad people, and God just wants the good people to kill all the bad people. That's an interpretation of God that Jesus comes challenging. Jesus says words like, you may have heard this, but I say this, and he reinterprets some of those stories. He reinterprets the laws. He kind of gives us new insight to perhaps the intention of some of those laws. All right, so we're here as followers of Jesus. So we look at the Hebrew Scriptures, or as Christians, what we call the Old Testament. We look at those through the lens of Jesus. And Jesus was about peace. Jesus was about told us about God who's a father who loves everybody, who loves good people and bad people, and everybody in between, which is most of us, right? We're all a bit of a mixture. So we're following one who saw God a very different way, and that's what we've got to hold to, and not let that muddy the waters. Fourth thing, final thing that I think can kind of complicate things, is that we've actually become desensitized to violence, right? Violence may not bother us that much, or we might not think it's that big a deal, because we're so used to hearing statistics like nearly 250,000 people have died in Syria, or we see the latest murder rates. And I'm going to put one set of statistics up in a moment, kind of statistics, but I've refrained from showing some of the other ones, because they're kind of, if we look at domestic abuse, violence towards children, murder rates, other forms of violent crime, hate crimes, all those kinds of things, it's pretty depressing reading. Now actually, at the same time, I think we've got to realize, I'm not sure we're any worse now than we've been throughout history, right? Interesting, look at the murder rate in the US. It's actually fairly flat. It's there's a few spikes here and there. I don't think we're necessarily any more a violent culture than we were 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 100 years ago. I mean, for instance, we don't have public executions anymore, right? You think about back in the day, how the culture was, if anything, I think more normally violent. And yet, we still have ridiculous murder rates. We still have a ridiculous number of people dying from war. We still have all kinds of abuse being perpetrated on people who can't defend themselves. So violence is a problem. It's just there, though, and we've kind of got used to it, rather than being horrified by it or feeling that something needs to be done about this, that we've got to rethink life in some kind of way, like Jesus came saying. He said, repent, rethink. If you're satisfied with life, if life's okay, then fine, but otherwise, think again, repent, think through, is there another way to live? And I guess I want to kind of just raise up this issue of violence in our culture and say, as followers of Jesus who are called to be wagers of peace, there's clearly a challenge there that we cannot ignore. Let me just show you one statistic, and I hope this doesn't create too many problems, but I'm going to put up, this is the US discretionary budget spending, okay, projected for 2015. There's a total of $1.1 trillion that's going to be spent by us, really, as taxpayers. Anybody pay the taxes? Most of us pay our taxes, right? If you don't, then we're in trouble. Okay, so 55% of that is spent on defense, war, and nuclear programs. All right? Now, Let's look at some other things. When it comes to foreign aid, it's 0.7%. All right? And then when we go to some other things like health, 5%, there's a few other things there, education, 6%. Interestingly, government, 5.5%, right? I mean, people complain about government, right? And I think government should be efficient and not just, a means to an end or an end to themselves. But compared to how much is spent on weapons and that kind of thing, it's minuscule. Now, what I'm not saying is please, people associated with the military here, please, I have military people in my family. I'm not saying it's wrong to be in the military, right? I'm not saying that, and I'm not really trying to make any political points here. Okay, these are just government figures. I'm not even maintaining that I have any idea about how to solve that problem. Right? So let me just put that out there. But I do want to say we've got a problem. We have a problem. Like if we've got our money, what we're going to spend. So that 55, let's put that into sort of weapons-related things. And there's 1% for people who are really needy around the world. And then we actually consider ourselves incredibly generous. Right? That's a problem. Now, again, I'm not saying that I've got a solution to it. It brings up all kinds of political questions, and we all have different political perspectives on that. What it shows, I think, is that, man, we really need peace. We really need some kind of alternative way forward. Like, that's just, we shouldn't be satisfied with that, right? We shouldn't be putting up with that. We as followers of Jesus, we should be saying, that's ringing alarm bells, huge alarm bells, because that's so much money and so much potential destruction, right? And potentially, I mean, just that much, we're bound to get into trouble. We're bound to misuse that. I mean, it's almost, we think about our human condition and the way we are, we're probably not going to handle that perfectly, right? So it should at least raise the issue, and perhaps looking at things like that can desensitize us to the fact that, okay, something is wrong. Something is wrong. We can't put up with this. Now, in the material, we're going to look at ways in which we can, what's a kind of response to that? What can we do about it? And we're going to have opportunity. I could tell you what I think, in my own perspective, but that's just my perspective, right? What's really important is that we engage with this and think through, okay, what part can we play in being, as followers of Jesus, wages of peace? We're going to have the opportunity for that. So I encourage you to wrestle with that material. Again, if you're not in a group, if you're in a group, you're going to go to your group and you're going to be forced to look at it. So that's a good thing. If you're not in a group, that's fine, but just get a copy of that material. You can download it offline. We have copies outside, and kind of wrestle with these questions. And then there's also an opportunity to give feedback, to say, I think we could do these things, or what about this, what about that? And we're going to gather that feedback as we have every week. Okay, so those are 4 issues that I think can sort of either paralyze us, muddy the waters, or cause us to sort of give up. Let's not give up on this issue of peace, because we're called to be wages of peace. And here's why. Let's look at just very briefly, some of Jesus' statements about these issues. So we're going to go to Matthew chapter 5. In the Beatitudes section, where Jesus says, blessed are these people, blessed are those people, he says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Okay, so it's interesting here. Peacemakers, this is an active thing. It's not a passive thing. It's not just blessed are those who live in peace. Blessed are those who are born into peaceful situations. Blessed are those who avoid conflict. It's rather, blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who see this problem, or see it as a problem, and are courageous enough to pursue peace and to try to bring peace. And those people are children of God. In other words, that's kind of like, this peacemaking is the fruit of God. It's like, that makes us children of God. It's not the other way around. Children of God are peacemakers. I mean, you can say that's true, presumably that's logically true, right? But it says peacemakers are children of God. I mean, there's lots of other things we might think make us children of God or not. What about peacemaking? If we're not peacemaking, if we're not actively seeking peace and working for peace, are we really children of God? Are we really carrying the heart of God? The heart of God that Jesus seemed to carry. The heart of God that Jesus seemed to understand. Let's look at another one. So a little bit later on in the chapter, Jesus says this. You have heard that it was said to the people long ago. Okay, so this is Jesus now kind of giving us a new, a fresh interpretation of God. You have heard that it was said to people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. And again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, raka, is answerable to the court. That's an offensive term. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Lots of interpretive issues there, but we're just going to focus on the fact here of we all have anger in our hearts, right? Jesus, in this whole section, is saying, okay, there's these outward bad things, like murder. Probably not many of us have committed murder, right? That's not. There may be some people who committed murder, that's true. I mean, that may be true. But that's, for most of us here, that may not be true. So we could just think, we're off the hook. We're following the law, we're good people. Jesus says, look, that's not really the issue. The intent of that law, because God is so kind and loving, is that we would be kind and loving. And that means don't let hatred and prejudice and anger and sort of superiority take seed in your heart. Jesus was constantly talking about the power of small things. He's talked about it in a very positive way. The kingdom of God is like a mustard seed. In other words, the small good things we do, and the small acts of faith, and the small embracing of faith, even though we may feel weak and not able to make it, that counts, that's important, because that grows into something significant. Likewise, though, I think Jesus is saying here, look, just a small bit of hatred, bit of anger, can blossom into something really awful. It can lead to murder. And we may not be committing murder, but we might harbor in us anger against certain groups or against certain nations because of the way they behave. That causes us to actually be okay with the comeuppance that they get, right? And sort of feel, well, you deserve that. And we're not the perpetrator of the violence, but people are doing that on our behalf. But we might feel that that's okay. Now, again, that sort of gets into political issues and political responses and all the rest of it. All I'm saying here is, could we think about this command of Jesus? As we think about our personal perspective, our political perspective, think about our own lives, could we think about this command of Jesus and how much does that, what Jesus is saying here, factor into our responses versus what's just a normal human knee-jerk reaction? And is there a possibility for change there? Okay, let's look at another one. You have heard that it was said, okay, Jesus is into these things called the antitheses, where he's reinterpreting very famous laws. He's saying, you've heard that it was said, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. In other words, you get what you get, you give what you get. Okay, so if somebody hits you, you hit them back. If somebody steals something from you, you take something from them. If somebody shoots at you, you shoot back. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. Let's just leave it there. He goes on to say some other things about along those lines. But so here we have what people like Martin Luther King and even people like Gandhi, who was not a Christian but had a huge amount of respect for Jesus. This is the seed of non-violence that they've latched onto and taken up as a way of life. This seems sort of ridiculous in a way, right? That it's because it sounds like where Jesus is saying, just be a doormat, just let everybody abuse you. If somebody hits you, give them another piece of your body to hit. And in some ways, that's true. I think Jesus is challenging the fact that you can't overcome hatred with hatred. Only love can do that, right? In the words of Martin Luther King. You can't overcome darkness with darkness. Only light can do that. Like somebody, somewhere along the line, in this crazy world, has to break the cycle of hatred and violence. And just say, I'm not going to hate back. I'm not going to fight back. I'm not going to do that. So, to some degree, this is a very simple thing of just don't fight back. But at another level, if we look into this a little bit more deeply and culturally, and I'm pretty sure we've talked about this here before, when we look at this issue of slapping around the face, the context here, and from some of the other words around this passage, seems like Jesus is talking especially to a group of people who are being oppressed by another culture, namely the Roman Empire. So they're occupied by the Romans. There's Roman soldiers, not necessarily breathing down their necks all the time, but the Roman soldiers can tell them what to do. They can make them carry their baggage for a mile for them. There's certain, under the occupation law, there's certain things that they are forced to do legally. And a Roman soldier, and anybody actually in that culture who felt superior to somebody else, could dismiss somebody else or disrespect somebody else by giving them a backhander. Okay, so this kind of slap we're talking about is a backhander. Most people are right-handed. Okay, so if you're going to give somebody a backhander, you're going to slap them around the right cheek. It's very hard to do a right-handed backhander on the right cheek. You have to go like that. You're not going to do it. It won't be very hard. You'll look really stupid. You do it like this, bang, like that, and it's a dismissive, I'm superior to you, you do what I say. You're under me. What Jesus seems to be saying is if you offer them your left cheek, okay, they now have to either change hands, unlikely, or they're going to slap you with the open hand, which is really saying, I'm your equal. That's how you fight an equal. That's how you engage in sort of peer level conflict. This is a cultural issue. So really what you're doing is saying, you're being non-violent, you're not returning like for like, but you're saying, treat me as an equal. If you want to be abusive like that, treat me as an equal. Treat me with respect. The idea is that you would cause that other person, either you're shaming them into withdrawing, or you're at least causing them to think through what they're doing and thinking through their actions. And of course, the truth is, you could end up getting beaten up, right? And I think many people who have courageously pursued non-violence have gotten beaten up, right? When we think about some of the stuff we were talking about, issues to do with race earlier on in the series, and we think about Martin Luther King, I frequently think, I mean, why take that risk? Why take that risk? What caused Martin Luther King and that movement to be so courageously committed to non-violence? And I think it's down to the fact that there's no other way of getting to where they got. I mean, there was a huge amount of pain and a huge amount of abuse that had to be endured as a result of that. But a pathway was trod that meant there was an outcome of peace rather than more violence. And we have to ask ourselves this question. Many of us here, I'm not sure I've ever been in a situation like that, really, where I've been abused like that, or put down like that. I mean, I've been put down, but not physically or whatever. But I know that whenever it happens, my hackles are, I want to get back. How dare you treat me like that? And I want to retaliate. I want to be violent back. I mean, my mind goes into all sorts of scenarios, right, of how I'm going to dress that person down next time they say that to me. It's always easy to do that when you're not in the moment, isn't it? You have to have these great one-liners that you can come up with. But to what degree, again, as we think about our own lives personally, how we are at work, how we are in our families, how we are in relationships, how we are in our political views, how we are in our social views, to what degree does this dominate our thinking and dominate our actions versus another kind of human response, which is more vengeful or retaliatory or more eye for eye, tooth for tooth? Which even that law was meant to contain violence rather than exacerbate violence. It was meant to be, if somebody slaps you, don't smash them in the mouth back. It's like, just slap them back. That's the intent of that law, right, was to contain punishment rather than it getting out of hand. And Jesus is coming on and saying, look, it's even more than that. He's teaching us a way of love. Final one. We'll wrap up with this. You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. We all have different enemies, right? We all identify different people as the enemy. We have enemies in our families. We have enemies at work. We have enemies at school. We have enemies in the national politics. We have enemies in international politics. We have sporting enemies. That's okay, I think. Maybe not. We have these enemies, right? People we vilify, and we listen to all the negative about them, and we dismiss any positive. And we may have good reasons for having those enemies. Okay, And Jesus does not say, agree with all your enemies, support all your enemies, send them big checks. He doesn't say, never say anything negative. It doesn't say anything critical. It doesn't say anything like that. Jesus just says, love your enemies and pray for them. We just don't, as followers of Jesus, have any excuse for hating anybody. It's a real bummer, actually, because it's like it sort of feels good sometimes to say something hateful or to take a side and all that. We just don't have any room for that as followers of Jesus, and so we get to decide: are we going to take this seriously, or are we just going to dismiss it as idealistic, or as well? That's for kind of relationships, It's not for how we live our lives in general. I don't think Jesus is making any saying, oh no, it's only in this context, right? He's talking about it as a way of life. We are called to love our enemies. So again, to what degree does this passage, what Jesus is challenging us about here, to what degree does this influence our thinking as we look at the world, as we look at conflict in our own personal lives and in conflicts that we may, through our political power or social power, have an opportunity to influence. So let's just allow those things to kind of simmer away in us as we engage with these questions over this next week or so. Again, I invite everybody to give feedback, and we're going to process a lot of that feedback next week at the forum. Everybody is really welcome to come to this forum. In fact, I'd really encourage you to please come. It is a big time commitment because you've been at church already, and then we'll stay on afterwards. There's information about it in the bulletin on the website. You get a free lunch, so that's always a good thing. There's free childcare as well. And we're going to be doing a sort of an interactive process called the World Cafe, which is, I've never experienced it before, but it gives us a chance to interact in small groups and large groups and to really process a lot of the feedback that's been given over the last few weeks, add our own to it, and we're going to as a community, try to discern together what is God saying to us about how we should respond at an individual level, but also beginning to move towards, are there some things we can do together to just kind of be a different force in the world, a force of peace, a force of justice, a force of love, in a way that we've been called to by Jesus. Okay, so really encourage you to come next week, stay on afterwards, make preparation for that. We're going to have communion now, and communion,